Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. INFJ. Lots in YouTube and on the internet about this particular personality type. Lots of interestingly titled videos especially. So, True Confessions of INFJ, Son of INFJ, Bride of INFJ, INFJ and the Wolfman. Actually, those don't exist yet, but I want to thank all the people who put those videos up for the time that they took to try to clarify a kind of difficult to understand personality type. In going through them, and I think at this point I've probably seen all of them, there's a lot of really good information and I learned some things too, but I came across a lot of misapprehensions, I think, or maybe stereotypes, hence the name of this video. INFJ Beyond the Stereotypes. And as somebody who is interested in psychology and who also identifies with that particular type, I wanted to go through some of the common ideas about what an INFJ is and does and is all about, and give my own opinion about that, and hopefully clarify some things, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. We're supposed to be difficult to understand. I'm not sure we're all that tough, but anyway, we'll see how it is as we go. So a few preliminaries. First of all, INFJ refers to a personality type under the myers-briggs type indicator. And this video assumes that you already have a working understanding of what that is and what the types are. Introverted, intuitive, feeling, judging is what INFJ stands for. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And I want to emphasize that types are not types of people. They're preferences, as the Myers-Briggs people often emphasize. They're habitual ways that we deal with the world. Jung talked about them in terms of functions of consciousness. The Myers-Briggs is based on his typology and added a few things too. So it's preferences and not people. That's the first thing. The other is, I'm going to hold type in this video as a kind of microcosm for seeing something important about human nature. I think that each psychological type has unique things to say about the total experience of being human, and we have to keep in mind that in terms of preferences, there are some things, some ways of holding consciousness that are more comfortable for us than others, hence the types, but that all of them are found in all of us. So the other thing I want to mention too is that I'm going to be saying we a lot, as INFJ, we, and all that. And I should own up front that I might be in some ways an atypical INFJ for a couple of reasons. One is that I've had a lot of therapy and trained as a psychotherapist, practiced psychotherapy for a while. I've spent years teaching depth psychology and immersed in that world. I had a very extroverted mother who I kind of collided with a bit growing up, and so that made an impression. We all hold this uniquely. We all hold it in our own individual ways. So the other thing I should mention too is that the Myers-Briggs, it's a good instrument, otherwise I wouldn't bother talking about it, but I think that of the four dimensions, INFJ being, the J being the fourth, the perceiving, judging, I think that's where the Myers-Briggs is the weakest. And I've noticed when I've taken it over the years that very often the setting that I'm taking it in determines whether I show up as a P or a J. So since I strongly identify with the J, and since the last time I took it, I showed up as a J, that's the piece I think that's accurate. But to me, what that suggests, as well as a lot of online articles about the lack of validity in the test, I think that the questions need strengthening, they need revision, and especially the ones in terms of that last fourth dimension, which is called structure. And I'll just read it to you right off the website. It says, by way of explanation, in dealing with the outside world, do you prefer to get things decided, or do you prefer to stay open to new information and options? So it's not that part necessarily that's the problem. It's the questions on the indicator that evoke responses that can be problematic. So that's one weakness to be aware of. And the other one I should mention is INFJ often gets confused with INFP, judging rather than perceiving. And there's an idea when you look superficially at the different sets of letters that indicate the types, that a deviation of just one, a change in just one letter indicates everything else about that type is the same except that one. So there are some people, for instance, that think that INFP and INFJ are the same except for that last dimension, how we structure our experience. That is not true. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So what I want to do in this video is go over some of the common ideas and a few stereotypes about who INFJs are, and use those, as I mentioned earlier, as jumping off points for what we can learn about humanity in general from this particular typology. So that's the first part of this video. For the second part, what I'd like to do is talk about some key differences between INFJ and INFP, because that comes up a lot. And then I want to finish by giving you kind of a picture of what an unconscious or neurotic INFJ might look like, because I think that a lot of the information on the internet dealing with INFJ actually kind of slips into that a little bit without stating it as such. So how we hold these makes an enormous difference in our lives and in how we're perceived by other people. So I want to underline that right off the bat. And maybe that's one other way I'm somewhat atypical. I insist that we are accountable for our own actions in the world, in the absence of a severe organic impairment, for instance. You can't bring it all back to type, excuse me, any more that you can bring it than you can bring it back to your natal chart or anything else. It's the magic, the juice is in what you do with what you're given. Can't emphasize that enough. So enough of the preliminaries. Let's get to some of the stereotypes, common ideas, what have you. So the first one that you hear a lot is that INFJs are the visionary people. The people with the visions, yeah. And it's a nice thought. I think it's true to some extent, but the piece that's sometimes missing is, not always, but sometimes, is that it's very important to us, if we have a dream or a vision or just an idea about something that could be better, to ground it practically. We're interested in not only, the heavenly heights and the depths and soul of the world and all that, but then what? Then what? So I think that's a distinguishing feature of INFJs, that we like the vision and then we like and now how do we implement it? So that's something to keep in mind. There's a term that I coined some years ago, Galahad complex. It refers to a different psychology, which is, I'm not sure where this would show up in the types, but so by Galahad complex, what I mean is when you're only a visionary. And if you think about Galahad and some of the tellings from the Arthurian cycle, where he's the one who finds the Grail, he's the perfect knight. He sees the Grail, he goes into a huge rapture, and then he and the Grail are taken up into heaven somewhere. And Arthur and the surviving knights are looking up going, well, that was helpful. Bye. So by Galahad complex, I mean something kind of similar to spiritual bypassing, but not in the sense that the visionary component is in any way not legitimate. It's that it's so consuming that there's nothing else. That's not characteristic of INFJ psychology, at least as I understand it. So the next idea, stereotype, what have you, is that we tend to be judgmental. And because we're introverts, we tend to be judgmental quietly. I think some of us might be, but I think it would be more accurate to say that we have a pretty robust sense of justice and fairness. And a Jungian take on that would be, it's because our feeling function, unlike INFP people, is extroverted. So I'll say more about that later, but our feelings are out there, and feelings aren't just emotions. In a Jungian sense, feelings are how you value things. Feelings are the sense internally that says, this is right, that's not. So because ours are extroverted, we tend to have kind of a sharp sense of justice. I think that's true. Next on the list, we feel like outsiders. Well, I think a lot of us identify with perhaps the Gnostic position, those ancient knowers from the Near East who talked about how, in their stories anyway, that we all come from a spiritual place of primal wholeness to a place of deficiency. So in a way, it's a fall, you know. I think some INFJs can identify with that, but probably most of us actually. But we have to be careful that that doesn't become a pose. Here I am on the outside, nobody understands me and all that. It can really be debilitating to get stuck in that kind of psychology. So the other part of that is, I think that although we sometimes seem somewhat distant in certain relationships, maybe with friends or coworkers or whoever, depending on what the relationship is, we do tend to feel close to humanity as a family. I think that's a distinguishing characteristic. And we are interested in making a world where everyone can be family. That's a driving force for us. So the next item, this one always makes me laugh a bit. I've seen this in, I don't know, several videos and articles online. INFJs were frightened that we don't fit in. No, we don't want to fit in. It's not really high on our list of priorities. You know, we look at what the norm is, and we think about something that Abraham Maslow said about the pathology of normalcy, and we get that. Who would want to be that way, you know? So I'll say more about that a little because it implies an elitism that I don't think is there. But it's more that we want to be members of an inclusive culture that doesn't yet exist, except in small pockets. That's what we want. At least that's what I want. So the next item is related to the one I just talked about. Somebody said that we're desperate for understanding, to be understood. Well, I think we're good if a small number of people understand us. At least I am. That's been true for me for a long time. So I don't really relate to the desperate for being understood part. That might have been truer of me when I was younger. But I think if we have a core group of people who really get us, we're happy. So next, this one irritates me because I think it's a misunderstanding. We're full of contradictions. A couple of people on YouTube said we're walking paradoxes. The great thing about YouTube is that the information can go out to a lot of people, which is also the bummer about YouTube, because you hear something like that in one video and you start saying it in another video, and pretty soon everybody's going, INFJs are a bunch of walking paradoxes. No, we're not. We're only walking paradoxes to people who think oppositionally. If you're stuck in oppositions, then of course we seem paradoxical. So here's a case in point. We're said to be social chameleons, which I think we have to own a little bit because we like getting along with people. Our feeling function's extroverted. We care about how people feel and we want them to feel good. So we can be that way. At the same time, we hate crowds because we're introverts. So that's not an opposition. That actually makes sense. We want people around us to feel good, to like themselves and all that stuff. And once you get up to like 20, 30, 50, 1,000, we're done. Bye, I'm going home. So it's not really a paradox. The other part that I mentioned kind of earlier is the whole aspiration to be practical dreamers, vision, implementation. Why do we tear those apart and say they're opposites? They're not, at least for us. We're not necessarily good at both of them. Some of us are better dreamers than implementers, and then some the other way around maybe. But it's not necessary to see that as an opposition. So as an INFJ, this walking paradox thing, I don't think we should take that on. I think that's a projection. Next, that we're homebodies. We like being at home a lot. I think so. I think that's true. But that's really the case with a lot of introverts. I seldom meet an introvert that doesn't have 20 handy excuses for not going anywhere. So I think that's more of an introvert thing than an INFJ thing. And I think also true of all of us who identify as being introverts, we get bored doing that too much. Too much at home time is not good. So after a few days, it's like, I'm going to go do something. So I don't know if that's truer of INFJs, but it may be. Next item is we work better alone or in small groups. I think that's true. I think that one's accurate. We're highly independent and we absolutely hate being micromanaged, and we don't like not being trusted to be self-directed. I have quit jobs when I was younger because somebody was trying to constantly get on me about, well, if you just do this more and that more. There was, when I was real young and working in the corporate world for a bit as a technical person, I remember this one boss couldn't even stand it if we had coffee cups on our desk, and I thought, I am never going to survive here, so I quit. Can't stand being micromanaged because we can manage ourselves, maybe too much. that tends to be a weakness or a shadow of INFJs. We're always on our own backs, so more about that momentarily. We're supposed to be the idealists. I think that's true, but again, I think it's more accurate actually to say that we go back and forth between idealism and disillusionment. So maybe idealistic most of the time, but we get into these disillusioned and even cynical moods, I think. And a figure that I like who demonstrates this is Luke Skywalker. In the Last Jedi film, where he's in the disillusionment phase for most of that film, and then he gets himself out of it. But so there's an image for how we operate that way. Next item, INFJs are supposedly too deep for small talk, and we're awkward at it. We can be, but our extroverted feeling function is highly dependent on context, and that may be one of the reasons that small talk in some settings is awkward, but not in others. And I think this is one of those areas where experience and learning really make a huge difference. I don't think we'll ever be extroverts, but over the years I've had to practice this enough. And I mentioned earlier I have a highly extroverted mom, so I got some training that way too. It's still not the most fun thing I ever do, but I don't have any problem going out with a group of people and just, making small talk. And it's not really an issue, I think, when you know how to do it. Maybe the awkwardness is in learning how to do it. So the next item, that we don't show our feelings and that we prefer intimacy to shallow relations. I think that might depend on how tired we are or if we're having a good day or not. I don't know if that's generally true. We do open up more in safe situations. I think that's true. And I also think that we can be guarded. And I'll have more to say about that in the next item. So I think there's some basis of truth in that. But anyway, so the next one has to do with emotional cutoff. We're famous for cutting people off who do something nefarious to us. I think we have to own that one. But here's a distinction that I think a lot of INFJ people make that they don't articulate. And I think this is one of those areas where maybe we could all learn a lesson regardless of whatever typology we identify with. So the way this seems to work is it's not that INFJ people are tolerant or intolerant of being lied to, for instance. I don't think that's the case because, I don't know if there's a human being standing who doesn't lie sometimes. And usually it's not all that significant. It's about little things like people are dating online and they lie a little bit about their age, or they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings and they lie a little bit and maybe turn a situation in a direction that it's not really turnable in. So there's things like that. Or with INFJ people in particular, somebody asks a nosy question and then it can be easier to just lie, or to say nothing, which is a more honest response. So we do it too. I don't think it's a matter of that. I think that what we experience are two different levels of deception or lying or dishonesty. That's the first one. It's kind of ubiquitous. The second one is when we learn that somebody has been systematically bullshitting us for a long time, or that their life is compartmentalized and we can't see into big pieces of it, and the reasons are all lies. And let's not get stuck on the content of what a particular lie is all about, because it's not really significant here. What is significant is when people use lying as a lifestyle choice, and they do it to us. They're deceptive about things that matter, right? When we get onto that, we're done. I think we have to own up to that. We don't need people like that in our lives. So I would actually say, of course I'm biased by being a member of this typology, but I would say actually that we have good boundaries around that. Who needs in a person's life somebody who's like that, who's consciously duplicitous in a very calculating way? So a brief sidebar, because I get asked this a lot when I've talked about this before. Can't people change? Sure, absolutely. It happens all the time. But the thing is, when somebody has a lifestyle that's basically deceitful, it tends to reflect a pretty severe amount of emotional immaturity. And they've had a lot of practice because they don't seem to have any problem lying. It doesn't hang them up. They don't hesitate. When someone's that far gone down the path of dishonesty, it generally takes not a single revelation, but a whole series of disasters brought on by their own behavior to really convince them, oh, I can't live like this anymore, right? And that's only part of it. So they go through a series of disastrous consequences. Then they have to do the hard part of actually going into themselves. Why am I like this? And how am I going to grow up? And who are going to be my mentors? And how am I going to get healing? And oftentimes a lot of therapy has to be involved. And so people do change, but when they're that deceitful, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of change. And so one way you can tell that somebody hasn't changed, when they come back to you for another bite, because you trusted them and then you realized who they were and you got rid of them, and then now they're back again, is when they put the burden of proof for believing in them on you. And it's on them. Evidence, right? So that's a lot of effort, so that's why we tend to be done. All right, next item. We spend, I think, a lot of time saying, I should have known that. And what I was just talking about might be a good example. This isn't particularly true of INFJ people. I think it's true of generally honest people and idealistic people, that you tend to be a magnet for the dishonest. They tend to seek you out. If you're trusting, if you're open, if you're comfortable with who you are, they tend to batten onto you. It's a lifelong problem, really. And you have to learn how to be discerning, right? So when you fall for it, because a lot of people are really good bullshitters, there's a tendency to say, I really should have known that. Maybe, but it doesn't really help to beat yourself up. What you should do instead is figure out why you didn't. And so then there's the internal reflection and, maybe talking it over with people, like, where was my weakness that I allowed this to happen? That kind of thing. And I do want to mention something that comes up sometimes, not always, but there are certain situations where you're actually prevented from knowing better. And I'm not talking about repressing the knowledge. What I mean is sometimes there are big life lessons that are waiting up ahead, and you're not quite ready for them because it means overturning everything. So there's a whole bunch of little things that you don't spot leading up to them, not because you're repressing the knowledge, but because you're not ready for it. It's almost as though something in the psyche, not your own shadow, but something in your psyche or extra psychic actually interferes with your ability to see what's actually happening until you get to that life stage, and then you wake up and go, oh wow, it was all of this stuff. So hopefully that'll get you off the hook a little bit. I saw something about INFJ people are really concerned about the legacy that we leave. I wouldn't literalize that. It's not about having kids or having monuments that have your name on them. It's more, I'm going to use the word tribal. I think it's more like, wanting to be useful to your group. Wanting to be able to say at the end, my efforts made a difference to these people. I think that's the kind of legacy that we're interested in, being useful. We're supposed to be the people that are very interested in other people. Extroverted feeling, right? You often hear about INFJs that were endlessly fascinated by what's going on with other people, and there's truth in that. We're also often people watchers. It's fun. But there's a point, there's a limit. And so this is one of those things that's seen as a contradiction that's not one. We want to know what people are really like, I think. We don't want gossip and trivia. That's different. We actually see that as screened, as a way of not knowing, as a way of covering up. And that's why I think why we like books on psychology better than we like hearing about the Kardashians, and we don't get desensitized usually. So the mass media in particular constantly feels like crap to us, because that's what it offers, right? If you think about the level of psychological maturity behind most of what's out there, it's really pathetic. Eric Fromm was complaining about that, and that was back in the 70s. It's worse now. So for us, it's just overstimulating. So in that sense, we're not interested. There are some things we don't need to know, right? But in terms of getting to know people on a deep level, I think that's fair. I think we're fascinated by that, which is why so often we end up being educators or psychologists or ministers or whatnot, where we can work with people intimately. It's fascinating. So the next item, we're supposed to be in the head people, cognitive, we think a lot and all that. I don't think that's true. I think that's what it looks like from the outside. I think that we intuit and empathize and imagine a lot without saying anything. And so maybe to other people that looks like we're in our heads or thinking, but we're really not. We're imagining and intuiting and feeling. That's what we're really doing. We tend to value thought only insofar as it's either creative or relational. We don't tend to be good at abstract thinking. Just philosophizing or coming up with theories for the sake of theorizing isn't something that we tend to be interested in. It has to make a difference somehow. It has to be relational somehow. So next item, I've got about 5 more of these, and then I'm going to change gears here. We're supposed to be perfectionists who often procrastinate. Well, we might have a perfectionistic streak. I mean, after all, this whole video is, not the whole video, but a big chunk of the video is about, we're not really this, we're more of that. There's a little perfectionism there maybe. But I think the truth is that we expect a lot of ourselves, and we tend to be harder on ourselves than we are on other people. Do it right or don't do it at all, right? I think that's true. So when we are perfectionistic, either we're neurotic or our perfectionism is showing up in very specific areas. When I'm studying a topic, I tend to be very perfectionistic in the sense of wanting to be thorough. I take lots of notes. I make sure they're organized where I can get to them. They're logically structured. So maybe that's where it shows up for me. but I don't think it's an overarching global perfectionism at all. Another one is that we don't smile much. My mom complained about this all through my childhood. We don't smile much because we're distracted with all our important thoughts or whatever. Maybe, but a couple of thoughts about that. One of them is we're supposed to be the people that stare without an expression. Like, actually, it works better with sunglasses. So there we go. Did you realize you were thinking about speeding? So when I should say when I do that, I'm usually in several different, not just thoughts, but feelings and imaginings, and it's because I'm listening. So when somebody tells me something that's interesting to me about themselves, I'm listening to it on several different levels simultaneously, and that takes a lot of processing power. So that could be part of it. But the other thing, I think there's a cultural piece here. Smiling a lot is a really American thing to do. If you go to other countries, Scandinavia, if you go to Finland, let's say, and you smile a lot, people are going to think you're up to something. So always being like, it tends to be us, in this country. So that's something to consider too. Next item, we have trouble taking criticism and we fear rejection. This is something that's hugely modified by learning. Being sensitive to criticism and all that stuff. Using myself as an example, when I was younger and more insecure, I think that was true. But when you're an author, your work gets criticized. When you're an academic, your ideas and teaching get criticized. And when you write a lot, criticism is an integral part of learning to be a better writer. You have the more direct and penetrating and on it your editor is, the better. You seek that out, right? So I think that's probably an example of an INFJ thing where the learning hasn't happened yet. You just haven't been exposed to enough criticism. Once you are, it gets easier. We're supposed to be, we're supposed to avoid confrontation. I think that we do that when it's not important. So we let the petty things go. Somebody says something that's just kind of a bit of bullshit, or they're exaggerating or whatever. We tend not to be the people that correct them because, again, we're very oriented toward how other people feel, and we don't want to make them feel bad or embarrass them or whatever. So I think in those situations, we do avoid confrontation. But when it's a question of justice, or when some kind of harm is being done, we can get right into that. We have an extroverted feeling response to that. So oftentimes we surprise people because they're used to us being easygoing, and then suddenly when it matters, we're like, you cannot do that. And they're like, So I think that's true of us. We're supposed to be organized planners, like everything's structured, in some areas, and in some it just doesn't matter. So I think that's uneven. And then finally, I saw some references online to that we value beauty and quality and learning and intimacy and depth, and also, all of which sounds nice, and also that we're complicated. So let me say something about that last one, and then we'll go on to the next topic. I don't think it's right to say complicated. I think what people mean is that we're many-sided. We tend to have different sides to our personality, different aspects of life that we're interested in, different interests. And because of our social piece, we tend to be different people in different situations. And so it could be that gets mistaken for being complicated. But I don't think complicated is right. I think many-sided is the accurate way of saying it. So I hope that was useful. Leave a comment and say how it lands for you. The next piece, so INFJ often mistaken for INFP. So some key differences between the two, at least as I understand them. INFP tends to lead with introverted feeling. Introverted feeling. And so for INFP people, their own feelings are primary. And it's not at all that they don't care about how other people feel, but they tend to pick up on it through their feelings. For INFJs, our emotions are out there all the time. Our emotions are in the world. They're almost like animals walking around out there. So even when something lands with us really personally, we tend to kind of have to go over there or over here to really get that. So introverts tend to go inward to understand their feelings, but INFJ people, I think, might be an exception to that in the sense that we actually have to talk to somebody to get it. Oftentimes I've had conversations about how I feel about something with close friends, or there's a dream that I can't quite unpack, and then I talk to a friend of mine and I suddenly get it. So there's something in us that works better when our feelings are connected to the world that way. So that might be a difference. INFP, their thinking and intuition tend to be extroverted. So they tend to be much better at predicting external events and circumstances than INFJ people. Oftentimes I've thought, oh, this will happen as a result of that, and then it doesn't. So I've given it up. The exception to that is when you have a collective dream about something that's coming. Those tend to be accurate for us. But trying to think it through, like as a result of this move, that party will come into power, or that one will go out, or whatever it is. We don't tend to be as good at that as INFP people. So this is a hopeless oversimplification, but just to give you a sense of the flavor of the differences, INFP are Pisces rather than Aquarius. And don't go look at your chart. I don't mean this literally. There's no correlation between how often one type is, forget that. Stylistically, INFP, I think, are more Pisces than Aquarius. We're more Aquarius. More emotion-based rather than using your emotions as a valuation. More Mr. Rogers or Carl Rogers than Freud or Jung. And I think more Nirvana than Valhalla. More about being than doing. And like I said, that's a huge generalization, but I think it's generally defensible. So for INFJ people, understanding is more important than empathy in terms of receiving it. Our feelings aren't repressed, they're outside. INFP people in general tend to put more emphasis on personal healing. We tend to put it more on telling yourself a different story about how to move forward. And of course, these overlap. They're not opposites or anything like that. Personal healing for INFPs, exploring the psyche for INFJ. Gnosis, cultural therapeutics rather than personal therapeutics. That's more an INFJ thing, I think. INFJ people are supposed to be the absorbers of other people's emotions. I think that's truer of INFP, and I'd really be curious for folks that identify as INFP for you to make a comment and give me your take on this, because you're the expert on that psychology. I'm not. I think INFP may be a bit more physically dissociated or apart from your body in some sense, unless you learn not to be. The learning is important. INFP probably intellectually more strategic. Outwardly, I mentioned that earlier, better predictors. INFJ people can tend to get over involved in our introverted thinking and intuition, which is internal for us. Intuition and thinking are we experience them as going on inside of us. But our sensate function, which gives you the facts, the impressions, the raw data, right? Our sensate function and our feeling function are both extroverted. So it gives us a grounding in the outer world that counterbalances our intuition and thinking. Lastly, INFP, in my experience anyway, a lot more emphasis on authenticity, and INFJ more emphasis on getting along, which doesn't feel fake to us. So I remember being irritated in college where an instructor was giving the humanistic psychology bit of that time, that was a while ago, on how we have an authentic self, a core self that's authentic, and a false self that we show everybody. False self is bad. The authentic self is good. You're never going to convince an INFJ of this. It just doesn't work for us. We don't have two selves. We've got dozens, and they're all real. The problem is when you get stuck in the wrong self in the wrong context, then it's fake. Or when you idealize one of those selves so much that you're stuck to it. And Jung talks about being stuck to the persona, that kind of thing, right? But he doesn't anywhere say that the persona itself has to go. In fact, in one of his, I forget which seminar, but somebody actually in the audience makes that suggestion. Don't we just take our persona off? And he's like, oh, heavens, no. You don't want to just bleed all over people or yell at people or whatever, you know. So we don't experience our social self as fake. We experience it as our social self, which is different from this self, that self, and the other self. So remember, many-sided, right? So here's a couple of things that aren't mentioned enough, I think. So by the numbers, INFJs are anywhere from 1 to 3% of the general population, which is why they keep saying that we're unusual. But we're overrepresented in the helping professions and probably Jungian psychology circles, INFP people also. We have a hidden but very potent extroversion, and we can, this video may be evidence that we can talk a lot when we want to, and especially if we feel involved with something or we feel understood. If we don't, and we do tend to be quiet like other introverts. INFJ people tend to be, when we're faced with something that we have a fundamental disagreement with, like a power structure that doesn't work for us or standards that we don't like, we're not rebels, we're heretics. So what I mean by that is, in general, the psychology of a rebel is pushing back against something. So when that something disappears, the rebellion disappears. A heretic, psychologically, as I understand it, is somebody who isn't really into rebellion and pushing back and forth. We're more interested in just following our own gods or our own principles or what have you. So when a group isn't getting along, we're the people who tend to say, you know what, none of this is working for me. I'm just going to go do my own thing. And anybody who wants to join me can join me, you know. We tend to be that kind of person. So as an example of that, there were several articles that I saw online in 2019 that were very critical of the MBTI on empirical grounds, right? Oh, the thing has no discernible validity. There hasn't been enough research and this and that and the other thing. So here's a contrast. So a rebel psychology would just push back against that. Somebody who took it to heart would be in the position of, let's do more studies and prove that we're scientific, which was kind of Jung's attitude. I think the INFJ attitude, at least as I represent it, is more like, how in the world is a natural science model that is specifically geared to exclude subjectivity possibly up to the challenge of studying inner states? Why should we take it seriously? You know, if it tells us about the weather, that kind of science, you know, materialistic science, empirical science, right? It tells us about the cosmos. It tells us about Earth and how all that works. Sure, we should take it seriously. It's good science. But when it starts trying to tell us what's happening on the inside, with a framework that's specifically devoted for the last 400 years to excluding any trace of subjectivity, we have to kind of say, nah, no thanks. So I don't even take it seriously enough to worry about it. I think that's an INFJ attitude. Let's see what else. A couple of people actually in different videos mentioned that we tend to be old souls, whatever that means. I got called that a lot when I was a kid, so that's a good thing for parents to know if you have a kid who's kind of an old soul. And I don't mean just parentified, turned into a mini parent. I mean somebody who asks questions that somebody their age shouldn't be asking. Then maybe you've got an INFJ on your hands. Tom Davison mentions this in his video on INFJs too, by the way. So we do tend to like routines. That should be mentioned, but we can break out of them when we need to. We like structure, but we can also be spontaneous when we need to. And here's something that, again, make a comment about this if you agree or don't, but I think it's particularly INFJ people who hate machinery that's programmed to simulate friendly humans. Ugh, right? I'm glad my car doesn't talk to me. There's a new elevator at work, and it's got this friendly, cheerful voice going up. Yeah, I'll take that floor, you know. Ugh. So we don't, you know, it's not like we're Neo-Luddites or anything. I'm talking to you on technology, but there's something weird about that, about machinery that's programmed to seem human. Something really wrong about that. Anyway, let me know if you're of a different personality type and you have that same predilection or bias or whatever. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I wanted to say something about the emotionally troubled INFJ and what that can look like. And this part will be brief because I want to wrap this up here. So, an emotionally troubled INFJ looks like this. First of all, oversensitive. Especially about being called out on your oversensitivity, right? I saw, I don't know, 3 or 4 videos that say, how dare you say we're emotionally oversensitive? Evidently, I don't need to say it. You're kind of demonstrating it, right? So, I mean, there's something really entitled about that, I think. Really defended, you know? Why can't you just laugh at it if people call you that? And just say, it's not that I'm oversensitive, you're just an emotional blockhead. You know? So, you know, a huge brooding oversensitivity might be part of it. That might be some room to grow, right? Emotionally troubled INFJ, isolationist. Isolation is deadly for us. It's deadly for all humans. But for us in particular, we start looking like Dr. Frankenstein, working away in that laboratory, going to build the key to immortality, and then it turns out to be our shadow. So self-isolating is a bad sign for anybody, but especially, I think, for us. Codependency. We're so wrapped up in taking care of other people that we ignore ourselves. That's kind of a constitutional problem for INFJ people who don't have good boundaries. We can sometimes over-prepare to the point of paralysis. There's the being hard on ourselves piece, and maybe some of the perfectionism. The constant fear of how others view us tends to be, like I said, emotionally troubled INFJs rather than, I think, the rest of us. Friendless, what's on my list? Highly defended, and also lost in intuition, like I mentioned earlier, the Galahad complex. I think those are all signs of work to do. They're all things that learning and in some cases maybe therapy can help with. So as a kind of overall way of dealing with that, I think it's necessary for us, and thank God I had good friends to remind me of this when I was growing up, especially in college, shouting out to Daniel, to remind you to not take yourself so seriously, right? How to laugh at yourself, how to get out more. Invariably, when I've been invited to go out and do something and I don't really feel like it, if I make myself do it, afterwards I'm glad. I've never had an experience of making myself doing it and then saying, well, that was a bust. I should have just stayed home. It's never happened. So a final couple of thoughts here to wrap this video up. So for Jung, and I think this is a valid point, the point of individuation, self-realization, becoming yourself, becoming an individual, is to develop sides of yourself that you don't normally live into. Develop sides of yourself that you don't normally live into. If you're introverted, what are you doing with your extroversion? If your feelings are extroverted, what about the ones in here, right? All the places where we're weak and undeveloped. So looking after that. And it's not only scary, but it's challenging and fun too. Becoming yourself, becoming a true human being, right? So that's one thing I would leave you with. The second thing is that the whole type thinking in types, is for understanding each other, not excluding. All right. When you find yourself saying, well, I'm of this type, and we're better than your type, or we're better at this, and time to reassess, right? And then the third thing is that, like I mentioned earlier, these are all possibilities in all of us. Thinking, feeling, sensing, perceiving, everything else, judging. These are all things that all of us do every day, almost every moment. So knowing our preferences is helpful for self-knowledge, and it also helps us relate to each other as human beings, and that really is what the typology is all about. So thanks very much.